Hi, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. What's up, YouTube? How y'all doing? I am super excited to be filming this video. I just got back from Africa. I had the best time of my whole entire life. It was amazing. And now I'm back. Thanks for coming back to my channel. If this is your first time, then just come on in, take your shoes off, stay a while, because I got a story to tell you. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about an exoneration. I'm going to tell you the story of somebody who has been wrongfully charged and convicted of a crime that they did not commit. And I'm gonna do my makeup for you. So if you like true crime, if you like watching people do their makeup, if you like happy endings, then you should hit the subscribe button because that's the type of stuff you're gonna see on my channel. Today, we will be going back to Illinois and we will be talking about a man named Rolando Cruz. And this story is so interesting because there's just like a lot of different pieces to it and you'll see why. Like it's really fascinating, honestly. My boy Rolando and his two little friends, Alex Hernandez and Robert Buckley, they kind of got themselves into a jam out here with the Illinois police. And actually, for anybody who follows me, if you guys are friends with me from college, this kind of happened like right in our backyard, which makes it kind of cool. The story was actually recommended to me by my mom, so shout out to her. So yeah, we're gonna jump into the story. And today I'm gonna be using my summertime foundation because your girl done went and got a tan, so now I'm dark. And my summertime foundation is the Juvias Place Velvety Matte Foundation, the I Am Magic Velvety Matte Foundation, and Ethiopia. I went to Ethiopia. Okay, actually I'm not gonna start there. I'm gonna start with Juvia's Place, the Mauve collection. Alright, so today we will be talking about a man by the name of Rolando Cruz. Rolando Cruz is a man of Hispanic descent. He was born and raised in a suburb of Chicago called Aurora, Illinois. Rolando Cruz had dropped out of school when he was in high school from East Aurora High School. He had enlisted in the Army Reserve for about 6 months before it just kind of didn't work out. He found himself kind of couch surfing between relatives, having a difficult time finding and maintaining work, and so he just kind of started getting into stuff. You know, they say idle time is the devil's playground. You're not supposed to you gotta keep yourself busy, but unfortunately he didn't have very many ways to keep himself busy, and so he started getting into like gangs and street life and things like that. And so he was kind of a lost soul at the time, didn't really have a lot of direction, didn't have a lot of guidance, and that kind of got him into this jam that he was in. So let's talk about the crime. On February 23rd, 1983, a 10-year-old girl named Jeanine Nicarico had been at her home in Naperville, Illinois. Jeannie had woke up that day and was suffering from a stomach flu, and so she stayed home from school. So dad worked as an engineer about an hour away in Chicago. Mom worked as a school secretary like nearby. Literally less than 3 hours after her family left for work and school, because she had 2 sisters as well, within 3 hours the little girl was gone. Her older sister came home later that day and discovered that the front door of their home had been kicked out of the door frame, and that kind of alarmed her and let her know, like, okay, something's wrong. The little girl called her mother, who came and made a police report. There were 2 items missing from the home when the police showed up: a small blanket and a bedsheet. And the only clue that had been left behind by the kidnapper was a footprint that was left outside the front door. Detective John Sand was the first to arrive and the lead detective on the case. Initially, police didn't have very much to go off of, but 2 days later, they were able to come up with a sketch to release to the community based on interviews that they had done and, you know, things that neighbors had said about like strange people or just unfamiliar people in the neighborhood, and they came up with a sketch of a white male who was 25 to 30 years of age. The same day that they were able to come up with this sketch, 2 days after the abduction, some hikers were smoking weed in the park, getting a little high on, when they came across 10-year-old Janine's body laying face down about 6 miles away from her home in a prairie, like wooded area. It was pretty clear that she had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. The coroner determined that Janine had died within 3 hours of her abduction. He was able to determine this because her body was still processing the grilled cheese and ice cream sandwich that she had for breakfast, and her cause of death was blood trauma to the head. She'd also been blindfolded with a towel. She also had a broken nose. She had scratches all over her legs and her body, and there were clear signs of both vaginal and anal sexual assault, which is just like so sad. So Naperville is not the biggest town. So this story was like the biggest investigation to happen in this town ever at the time. Probably still to this day is probably one of the largest cases. The reward money at the time was $5,000, and it doubled pretty quickly from $5,000 to $10,000, and this kind of gave a lot of incentive to people, you know, in the neighborhood to start coming forward with more tips about any suspicious activity that they have seen or heard of going on. They came across a tip that said, there's a kid in the neighborhood who might know something about what happened to Janine. His name is Alejandro Hernandez, which is interesting because that's my last name, Hernandez, and pretty much my whole life my locker was right next to somebody named Alex Hernandez, who is obviously not this Alex Hernandez. My locker was next to his all the way from like 4th grade when I got my first locker until I graduated high school. We went to all the same schools, and because our names were so close, we always had like our lockers right adjacent to each other. I wonder if he remembers that. Anyways, they call in Alejandro, who is 17 at the time. Alejandro, or Crazy Alex as he was known in the neighborhood, comes into the police department and he's like, no, I don't think I know anything about this. Until the police are like, oh, but did you hear about the reward? It's $10,000. To which Alex is like, oh, you mean that case? That girl. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I did hear some people talking about it. One night when I was riding around and getting it with my friends in the car, we was drinking and having a good old time, and a couple of the guys actually mentioned that they were talking about the murder of a little girl in Naperville. And the police are like, you don't say. And at first it's like, it sounds like the police were still even weary then, like, yeah, you're just talking. But the fact that he said it, they had to like take it seriously and investigate it, because they weren't really sure on like what to think or believe, because he didn't really give any detail. He was just kind of like, oh yeah, now that you mention it, I did hear some people talking about something that has like some of these words that you guys are talking about, like murder and 10-year-old girl in Naperville, like, yeah. So they're like, we need to figure out a way to get him to talk a little bit more. So they go and grab his homeboy, who is serving time in jail for like a burglary, and they go and retrieve him from the juvie, and they put him in the same room as Alex, and they leave a box on the table, and they're like, there's your $10,000, and they walk out the room, and they just let them talk for hours. Alex is kind of like, he's kind of just stumbling and saying anything and kind of just like throwing stuff out there, but all the while he's mentioning a bunch of different names. And so the police are sitting there, they're recording all of the names that he's mentioning, and they're like, okay, we're gonna look into all of these people, 2 of which were named Steven Buckley and Rolando Cruz, who we are talking about today. First, officers go and they talk to Buckley, and they're like, hey, have you ever seen these shoes before? And they show him a picture of the boots that could have left the footprint that was outside of the house. Buckley is looking at the picture and he's like, yeah, I think actually I do kind of have some shoes that look like that. And so the police officers are like, oh yeah, really? Well, we would love for you to show them to us. We'd love to see them. He's like, sure, no problem. You can come over to my house. We'll get them. And this initially threw officers off because they're like, okay, if homeboy committed this crime, like why would he just like willingly give up the evidence? They're like, okay, he's got the shoes, like let's go look at him. So then they went to go interview Rolando Cruz, and you know, he's like, sorry guys, I can't help you, like I don't know anything about this situation with this girl, but I mean, I can keep my ears and eyes open, and if I hear anything, like I'll let you know. And the officers kind of take that as like an invitation of like, okay, he's going to be like our informant, basically. Like he's gonna go out and be in the streets, and then he's gonna let us know like if he finds or hears any information about what happened to this little girl. So basically over the next few months they had constant communication with Rolando Cruz, and they were constantly asking him for updates about things that he had found out in the neighborhood, people he had talked to, if he had heard any new information that could lead to an arrest or help them with figuring out, you know, who did this to Janine. They were in such close communication with him over those next few months that they actually put him up in a hotel. Well, they started him at a hotel, and then they put him up in an apartment in a different suburb called Wheaton, Illinois, which was known to be kind of like a more quiet, reserved, like white suburban area. And so it was kind of like, knowing what we know now, that Rolando Cruz is going to be charged for this crime. If they thought that he was a dangerous threat to society, if they thought that he committed this crime where he kidnapped this young girl, it was my dog, where they thought that he kidnapped and raped and murdered this young girl, why would they put him up in a neighborhood where he could cause harm to other families? It wasn't too long before Rolando got into some shit. My homeboy liked to take things that he couldn't afford, and so he was arrested on a burglary charge. And upon just growing impatient with the investigation, not having too many answers, but having these three men who have been kind of like consistently involved in the case, right? They have Rolando, they're using him as somewhat of an informant. They have Alex, who they originally questioned, who said that he may or may not have heard something, but really he just wanted the reward money. And then they have Steven Buckley, who volunteered to show them his boots that he has that kind of look like they could have left the footprint outside the house. And so when Rolando is picked up for burglary in this nice little suburb that they didn't put him up in, they're like, you know what, I'm all done waiting. So they just round up the three guys, and they're like, here's what happened. The three of y'all got together and decided that y'all were gonna rob this house, and when you went in to go rob the house, you found the little girl there, and upon finding the little girl, you guys took her, raped her, murdered her, left her for dead because she saw you guys. And they just decided that that was the story that they were gonna go with. And on March 9th, 1984, on the basis of statements made by police and several witnesses, they arrested and charged the three men with the kidnapping and murder of Janine. Now, remember the lead detective, Robert Sand, he kind of knew like this don't really make no damn sense. We're like really reaching right now because we don't have any evidence tying any of these guys to the crime. And on top of that, like none of them have even made it look or appear as if they knew anything about this crime. He didn't have a lot of faith in this method, right? And just deciding that they were going to charge them. And so he kind of continued to do his own investigations on this side, trying to figure out what really happened to Janine, because he was pretty convinced that these three had nothing to do with it. The department is like, all right, we've got them, we caught them, we cracked the case. They've told the public like everything is good. And so upon hearing that Robert Sand was still investigating other leads, they call him into the station and they're like, hey man, you're like messing up our rep right now. Like we have already decided that we're gonna charge these three guys. So what are you doing? And he's like, well, this don't make a lot of sense to me, and I'm just trying to figure out, you know, what really happened for the sake of the family. And they basically were like, we're gonna need you to stop because we've already collectively decided that we were gonna charge them, so you're outnumbered. And in hearing this, literally the lead detective on the case said that if he couldn't find out what really happened to her, then he had no business in this job, and he resigned right then and there in protest of charging these 3 guys for no reason when there's somebody who actually did do this out there. We're not giving this poor girl the due diligence that she deserves by actually, you know, committing to investigating further and finding out like what really happened to her. And so he was like, all right, y'all don't want to let me, you know, do this my way and figure out what really happened. I quit. And he resigned from the force that day. I feel like you just don't see that very often or ever, especially back then. Somebody being so willing to like take a stand against their job, especially in a situation like police, like the police force. That's like a very bold move to make. I mean, I'm just like, that's impressive. They're like, all right, bet he was kind of like the last obstacle. We're just gonna pursue these charges against these 3 guys. And so the trial begins in 1985, and Rolando Cruz and Alex Hernandez were tried together, and Steven Buckley was in a separate trial. How pretty is this color? Oh my god. One of the jurors described the ambiance and just like the energy going into the trial was that somebody has to pay for what happened to this little girl. That was just like the basic understanding that somebody is gonna pay for this. Oh, that's my first time ever doing like the little tape trick. So the evidence, first of all, they had the footprint. They were trying to charge Steven Buckley with the footprint, right? Because they went to him and they said, hey, do you have this shoe? And he was like, yeah. And they were like, bet you're our guy. A shoe print examiner in the DuPage County Police Department, which is just like, I didn't know that was like a thing, like a job. Just very interesting. Or is that just like they just give you that title? Like whatever your role is in the case, that becomes your title. So in this case, he was a shoe print examiner, but in another case, he could have been something else. I don't know. He completed a examination of the footprints and said that the footprint of Steven Buckley did not match the one that was found at the crime scene. However, they omitted this from evidence. They omitted from, you know, giving this information to the defense attorney and just withheld it. And instead of admitting it for evidence, they just went and found a different examiner to run another test and told the original shoe print examiner not to ever speak of this to anybody. Just don't tell anybody that you even ran the test, let alone what you found. So not only did they withhold this evidence, but they also like verbally told this man to keep quiet about his findings. And this kind of became a cycle. Like they had somebody examine the footprint, the results came back negative, they told them to be quiet and found somebody else to do another test. They literally spent $1,000 a day on testing, trying to prove this point, which is a lot of money in 1984. After about 4 different footprint experts, they found a woman out of North Carolina named Louise Robbins, who was said to be an expert on footprints and testified that not only did his boot match the footprint that was found at the crime scene, but based on the footprint alone, she could identify the race and height of the person who left the footprint. How can you look at a footprint and identify somebody's race by the footprint? The height might be a little bit more believable because I feel like those 2 things kind of correlate, like height and shoe size. And so, okay, fine, she might be able to get away with possibly pretending like she could know how tall somebody is based on their shoe print, given that she's an expert and all. But how in life could you determine somebody's race by a dirt footprint that is left by a shoe that is made in a factory? Anyways, she was getting the bag, you know, $1,000 a day, running these tests and providing this statement. So they got her to testify and say that, you know, it was him. So the next piece of evidence that they were using was a confession, quote unquote. 2 days before this trial started, one of the detectives made a claim that 2 years ago, before the trial started, during their interrogation, Rolando Cruz had made his version of a confession. He says that during one of the interrogations, Rolando Cruz began to tell the detectives about a dream that he had had, where a young girl was dragged from her home in a blanket, raped and struck in the head so hard that it left an impression, like an indent, on her head. And then she was dumped face down in a field. And this confession supposedly was made on May 9th of 1983, which would have been before any details of the case were released. And so the only way that anybody could possibly know anything like that even happened to the girl was if they were there. It's rather convenient that these detectives all of a sudden remembered this confession 2 days before the trial started, right? Rolando Cruz denied ever having any visions of the sort, any dreams of the sort. He definitely denied ever saying that out loud, that he ever had any dreams or visions of this nature. And then his defense team was like, well, okay, if what you're saying is true and he confessed this to you, where's the, the taped confession? Where's from when you guys interrogated him on film? Like, where did he say that? Show us. And the officers are like, oh, you know what? Actually, we didn't videotape that interrogation. We actually interrogated him the next day on videotape. And he didn't confess that day. And so the defense is like, well, okay, if he made the confession the day before and then you had him on video the next day, why wouldn't you follow up on that confession when the tape is rolling? Like, why wouldn't you ask him about, hey, remember yesterday when you confessed to this? Why don't you tell me more about that? Not only did they not follow up in the videotaped confession, they did not write any report. There was no paperwork following up on the fact that he had made a confession. There was nothing documenting this dream visions that they claimed that he, said that he made. Nothing. It was just these detectives coming forward and saying like, yeah, he said he did it. And unfortunately, that left the defense with the task of proving that the cops were lying. Like, they couldn't just prove that Rolando didn't say that. They had to prove that the cops were lying, which is a difficult task because they're police officers and they got the whole unspoken immunity. So the last kind of evidence that they were gathering and using during the trial were a bunch of witness testimonies. And they had several, from inmates who shared cells with these guys, to the guards who were working at the jails, to even people from their own families, like their cousins were coming forward. And everybody kind of had like an incentive to testify, whether it was the reward money, whether it was getting time off their sentence, or some other type of promise that was made to them by the, district attorney to get them to testify. Everybody kind of had like an incentive. And regardless of the fact that these witnesses had incentives, the fact that there was so many of them had been like kind of tallying up in the jury's mind, right? Like, they have witness after witness after witness, and the jury's kind of like, okay, this is a lot of people who are saying that these guys like either told them that they made some sort of confession, or they have some sort of information or knowledge that these guys did it. It took the jury 2 days to deliberate, and in 1985, Rolando Cruz and Alex Hernandez were found guilty of the kidnapping, rape, and murder of 10-year-old Janine, and they were both sentenced to death by lethal injection. Both men were 21 years old at the time. The jury was unable to reach a verdict on Steven Buckley's trial, and so he had to be retried. Both Rolando Cruz and Steven Buckley's verdicts were reversed, and they were both granted new trials. So essentially all three men went through a second trial. So I'm just going to highlight some of the differences between the first trial and the second trial instead of going through like the whole entire thing again. They had a testimony from a man named Robert Turner, who was an inmate at the Menards Correctional Facility where Rolando Cruz had been serving his time throughout the trial. And he basically said that Rolando confessed to him and told him, about the whole plan, that he kidnapped this girl and drug her out and beat her with a crowbar and did all the things. And that on one occasion he even mentioned the presence of somebody else, somebody named Dugan. The state also introduced a piece of physical evidence, which was a small amount of blood that was found on and around the prairie area where Janine's body was found. There was also an impression in the mud about 2 feet away from where her body was. That was a footprint. There were also 2 distinct footprints that were found outside of the home, which is like, where was all of this stuff during the first trial? But it's neither here nor there. A tire impression was found along the grass in front of the home of Janine, and inside of that tire track was another shoe print, There was also seminal fluid that was collected from Giannine's body, and this DNA was not a match for neither Steven Buckley nor Alex Hernandez, so it exempted them from being able to use that against them in court. But it didn't necessarily dismiss Rolando Cruz. There was also a huge piece of evidence that was missing in the second trial that was not being used. As in the first trial, the prosecution relied a lot on the three main pieces of evidence that they had, which was the shoe print. Starting with the shoe print, they kind of went back over through all of the same testing. And they actually had like a specialist from Nike come and testify at the trial. And the specialist concluded that the footprint could not have possibly belonged to any of the men. In fact, it was a footprint that was a size 5 or 6 in women's, and it belonged to a woman. However, the prosecution did not give this information to the defense team as required by law. So they put the Nike specialist on trial, but they didn't ask him about the shoe size, the possible gender of whoever was wearing the shoe, or anything that would, you know, reveal what his findings were. Overall, the Illinois Supreme Court ended up upholding Cruz's conviction in the second trial. And so once again, he was sentenced to death. Alex Hernandez, however, had a hung jury, and so they tried him a third time. And in the third trial, they found him guilty, but instead of sentencing him to death as well, they sentenced him to life in prison. So we're gonna go backwards for a second. 3 months after all three men were found guilty the first time, in 1985, a man by the name of Brian Dugan, wow, this concealer is fantastic. A man by the name of Brian Dugan was arrested in LaSalle County in connection with the kidnapping, rape, and murder of an 8-year-old girl named Melissa Ackerman. Initially, detectives asked Brian Dugan about Giannine's murder as well, and he just didn't have anything to say about it. He just refused to speak. However, as time went on, because he was starting to be charged for this other murder, he informed detectives that he was responsible for that of Melissa Ackerman, the 8-year-old that he had been arrested for originally, a woman named Donna Schnorr, and an unidentified person in DuPage County. But he didn't say who the third person was. And the reason that he started coming forward with these crimes is because he was afraid that he was gonna be found guilty anyway. Like, during all of this time is when DNA testing was really starting to progress. They were making significant strides just in the development of using DNA testing, and so he was like, oh shit, like I'm about to get caught up, right? Like my DNA is all over these cases, and if I get tried for all of these, they're for sure gonna give me the death penalty. And so he was like, if I confess or give them information about these, I can use that as leverage to not get the death penalty and instead negotiate a life sentence. And so that was his strategy. Like, he was like, all right, I'm gonna give them inch by inch, little piece by piece, and they're gonna give me what I want. On November 13th of 1985, Brian Dugan sat down with prosecutors and was like, all right, this is the deal. You guys cannot pursue me for the death penalty if I give you details about this murder. And I mean, Brian Dugan also verbally said that he didn't want these other guys serving time for a crime that he committed. In that initial meeting, the prosecutors didn't accept his deal. They said that it was fruitless, they didn't believe him, because they had their heart set on these other 3 guys already. 3 days later, on November 16th, they came to have this conversation again, and he was like, listen, I'm gonna tell y'all what happened, because he wanted to clear the books and he didn't want these 2 guys serving time for his crime, but he also didn't want to get the death penalty. So he was like, all right, final offer. Do y'all want to know what happened, or do y'all not want to know what happened? Because I'm willing to tell you if you're not going to pursue me for the death penalty. But I'm only gonna, have this conversation so many times. You guys already denied me 1 time. Take it or leave it. And so prosecutors agreed to hear him out. And this is his version of events that happened that day. He said that he was driving around in his green Plymouth Velar, having a good old time, hitting his little tree, catching a vibe, getting a little litty. And He was driving around DuPage County and found himself in the area of Naperville. He stopped at the home of an elderly woman and asked her to borrow a screwdriver because he was having some problems with his car. And the woman gave him a screwdriver. After he left the old woman's house, he continued to have car trouble, and so he stopped at another house, which happened to be the house of the Nicaricos, where Giannine had been staying home from school. He looked in the window, he saw the little girl laying on the couch, and he started asking her questions just through the window. And he was like, "Hey, I need a screwdriver. My car is fucking up. Do you have one?" And she was like, "No." And he was like, "Well, can I use your phone?" She was like, "I can't let you do that because, mind you, before leaving for work, her parents told her very specifically not to open the door for anybody." Upon him asking, "Hey, can I use your phone?" she said, I can't let you use my phone." And he said in that moment he knew that she was home alone. And he kicked down the door and chased the girl through the house. She ran upstairs. He grabbed a sheet and wrapped her up in the sheet, blindfolded her with a towel, gagged her, taped the towel around her face, threw her in the car, and took off. He said he then drove to the wooded prairie area, untied her, made her get in the back seat, had forced oral, vaginal, and anal sex with the girl. He confirmed that once they made it outside the car, he struck her several times with a tire iron, and that she hit her head as she fell, like on her way down. Then he dragged her body to a wooded area where there were bushes and hit her again with a fallen tree branch. He stated that he left the tree branch at the scene, but took the tire iron. During the course of this, I mean, Brian Dugan, he was like completely willing to prove that he was telling the truth, because there were a couple of instances where he was telling the story and the officers seemed a little skeptical about if they believed him or not. And he was like, "Bet." He was like, "Why don't we go drive around? I'll show you exactly where everything happened. And I can give you like detailed descriptions of what the house looked like inside, what the house looked like outside, the neighborhood." He's like, "I'll take a lie detector test." He was able to give a detailed description of the inside of the home. So like when you walk in, the stairs, I guess if you go downstairs, there was like the recreation, the like playroom. He was able to describe the flooring. He was able to describe where the TV was in the different rooms. Just things that up until this point, like, none of the other men were this advanced into the case. He even knew like of the way in which like the doors opened, like the closet door opened to the left, and the colors in the home and where the lights were. Very, very detailed descriptions of what the inside of the house looked like. Like I mean, for him to have only seen it from staring outside the house, talking to her, and then rapidly moving through the house when he was tussling with her, trying to get her. I mean, he had a very imprinted picture of everything. He even said that when he threw her in the bed wasn't made up and he just grabbed the sheets, and her sister testified that that was true, that she didn't make her bed that morning. So then he also was like, "All right, come on, let's do a drive around. Like, I'll take you guys around and show you my little stomping grounds where everything happened." During the drive around, Dugan showed police like, "Oh, you know, this is the first lady. This is the older lady. I stopped at her house to ask her for a screwdriver, and she gave me one, and this is kind of like where I fixed my car." And the officer was like, "Oh, okay, so like where is Giannine's house?" He was like, "Oh, we passed it. It was back there." And he was right. Like, he knew exactly where everything was. And he even like made comments about like the upkeep of the house. Like, he was like, "Oh wow, they changed the color of the mailbox. Like, that's something new." These are comments that he's making like while he's driving around with the police. Like, he is so familiar with this house. All of this happened 3 months after the first trial took place. Keep in mind that the men had a whole second trial in which they were found guilty again. And even though Brian made this confession to police, during the second trial, they did not use it in court. And so the men were still tried after Brian took the police out and showed them everything and gave them a detailed description of everything that happened. The men were still tried as if he never as if Brian never came forward and said anything. So that is the story of what happened to Janine in real life. This man, Brian Dugan, he went on to commit 2 more murders, several more rape and attempted rapes. So now it's 1995 and it's time for the 3rd trial to start for these men. 3 weeks before the trial started, like I said, during this time, there were being significant advancements made in DNA testing. Just scientific evidence was becoming, you know, more invested in and easier to prove. And so 3 weeks to prior to the 3rd trial starting, the premier expert technician in Illinois made a discovery that there was a 3 out of 100th of a 1% chance that anybody other than Brian Dugan was involved in the crime, or at least, you know, that anybody besides him had sex with the young girl. You remember the 2 detectives who came forward and said that Rolando Cruz had made a confession to them about his vision that he had. So apparently the day that he made this said confession, the officer stated that they called their supervisor and made him aware of this, right? And the supervisor testified to this in court. Well, in the 3rd trial, the supervisor came forward and said that after checking his credit card receipts, he realized that he was in Florida at the time and couldn't have possibly received a phone call from these guys. So he basically admitted that he lied and said that he received a phone call from them with the admission of guilt, even though he didn't, and that never happened. Gorgeous, gorgeous girls love blush. With these 2 pieces of evidence and Brian's admission of guilt, on November 3rd of 1995, the charges against Rolando Cruz were dropped and he was released from prison. So I have a crazy, weird rant. I mean, it's just like a crazy fun fact that I discovered while I was doing research on this case. It's like some wild shit, and this is what I mean when I say like this dude Brian Dugan, this is like some other shit. So Brian Dugan, he is the one who committed this crime. He is like the serial killer, right? So, in doing research, I found out that he's had quite an interesting life. He had all the signs of like a psychopath, right? He was like starting fires and hurting animals and molesting his sister, and his parents were alcoholics and didn't really pay enough attention to him and his brother, who was also kind of like a really troubled kid. It's said that they were living in like group homes and were possibly molested themselves. But the craziest thing of all, and it's really not like a fun fact or a funny fact, but it's so fucking interesting, that Brian Dugan was actually a victim of John Wayne Gacy, who is one of the most notorious child murderers of all time. He's obviously like very infamous. If you're a part of the true crime community, or just like know about like the history of things like this, he was a person in Chicago. He used to dress up as a clown. He was found, like when the police discovered that he was responsible for murdering kids, he had murdered like so many young boys in the neighborhood and had them like buried in his backyard. It was like the craziest shit ever. But he is like a super famous, like up there with like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer and like all these, you know, the most notorious like serial killers. And so it is said that as a child or as a young teenage boy, Brian was working at a supermarket, and one day he was picked up by John Wayne Gacy, and I don't know, he just got in his car. John Wayne Gacy molested Brian and then dropped him back off at the supermarket and left him there and never saw him again. But it's just crazy to think that Brian became a serial killer after he was the victim of a serial killer. I was like reading, they just casually threw that in there when I was reading through this stuff, and I was like, whoa, that's wild. If you are not familiar with John Wayne Gacy, Google it. There are several videos on YouTube. I mean, it's not really like what are the odds, because Brian was like already exhibiting all the signs before he ever even met John Wayne Gacy. You know, been doing things like setting the family cat on fire, attacking his siblings, other pieces of their home on fire, and just like random stuff like that. Like he was already exhibiting like signs of a little terrorist. But I just thought that was just like the craziest thing ever. So after Rolando Cruz was exonerated, it took about a month before Alex Hernandez was also released from prison. There were 7 officers that were indicted on charges due to the handling of this case. So the supervisor who came forward and said that he never actually, received the call, that he kind of lied to protect the 2 officers. His name was Thomas Knight, and then the 2 officers who originally made the claims about the visions that never happened, about the dream and the confessions that they basically made up. 3 of them were indicted on charges, as well as 4 other officials from the DuPage County Police Department. There were 47 charges of conspiracy to convict Rolando Cruz of the murder that he did not commit. There were charges of perjury, obstruction of justice, withholding evidence, being aware of exculpatory evidence, and the 7 of the officers became known as the DuPage 7. The trial for the 7 officers began in April of 1999, but sadly in June of 1999 the officers were all acquitted of their charges by Judge William Kelly. In the year 2000, Rolando Cruz, Alex Hernandez, and Steven Buckley all received a settlement from DuPage County for their wrongful conviction. Overall, Rolando Cruz spent 12 years in prison, 10 of which were served on death row. In 2005, Brian Dugan was indicted for the murder of Giannine Nicorico, and he was sentenced to death. Actually, the public outcry from Rolando Cruz's case, being that he was sentenced to death, resulted in the governor at the time, George Ryan, declaring a moratorium of the death penalty. And on March 9, 2011, Governor Pat Quinn signed legislation abolishing the death penalty in Illinois, and that transferred Brian Dugan's sentence into 3 consecutive life sentences for all 3 kidnapping, assaults, and murders of the young women. After prison, Rolando Cruz says that he has spent a lot of time just trying to figure out how to live life on the other side of freedom, how to have freedom, how to live, and how to be alive, which relatable. Since his release from prison, he has become an advocate for reform in the criminal justice system, lecturing nationally and internationally on topics such as the death penalty. But he seems to be most proud of his work helping convicted felons and murderers upon their release from prison, whether they were guilty or not guilty, to just reform their life and try to get on. And that is the story. What do you guys think? This is the finished look. I've been dying to do a pink look forever, so here it is. First of all, I want to know what you guys think about Brian Dugan. Like, do you think that he became a serial killer because he was involved with one? He was kind of exhibiting those like main characteristics of a psychopath before he had any engagement with John Wayne Gacy, but I think it's just like so crazy and bizarre that he interacted with him and was one of his victims and then like went on to commit these crimes. Like, it's just wild to me to think that. Rest in peace to Giannine, as well as the other young ladies that were victims of Brian. He is still serving time in somewhere, I think in Menard County Correctional Facility in southern Illinois, but I'm not sure. It might be Statesville. I think I read something like that. But he's still alive and kicking and serving out his his consecutive life sentences. All the other men received their check. They got their funds, and everybody's well taken care of. But I want to know, what do you guys think about just this case? Alex, I guess, kind of inserted himself by wanting to provide information to get the reward, the $10,000 reward, and ended up being a suspect. I mean, Rolando Cruz was working with the police for months before they decided to arrest and charge him for the crime. Mind you, these are like young kids. They were only 19 at the time that they were arrested. They were 21 at the time that they were convicted and sentenced to death, which is just like terrifying if you think about it. But also, this is kind of like a testimony to like why you just gotta mind your business and just like don't interact with the police if you don't have to. Like, don't trust them, don't believe them when they like try to sell you the dream or make you promises. Like, just mind your own business all the time. Don't come for them unless they send for you. Don't insert yourself in their business. That's today's story, and this is today's look. Let me know if you guys want to see me do a specific other look, or what kind of stories you want to hear about in the future. If you know anybody in your neighborhood, like I said, this one was referred to me by my mom, and this actually happened like right in, around her neighborhood. And so if you feel compelled to Google or look into the crime and the corruption or the exonerations of people in your area, in your town, in your state, feel free to drop names below. I'm happy to do a video on their story. Be looking out. I did vlog like everything from Africa as much as possible, as much as I could remember. So as soon as I finish putting all of that footage together, there will be a vlog up on the channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you enjoyed the story, if you enjoyed watching me do my look, then please, please, please subscribe. If you know anybody who likes true crime and likes to hear about this stuff, tell a friend, tell a friend, tell a friend, share, comment, follow me on social media for updates and information regarding the channel. And other than that, I hope you guys had a great start to your new year. I know I'm late in saying that because it's been some weeks, but Happy New Year. I hope that you guys are all taking care of yourself. I hope you have a great rest of your day today, and I will see you next time. Peace.